Emily wakes up every morning with a racing heart, but no danger. Doctors say it's anxiety, but it's something deeper. When the body holds the memory of threat, it reacts even when you're safe. Healing starts when we stop ignoring the body and start listening. You're not crazy. You're not weak. You're carrying something that was never yours.
I read the summary of the study that was recently conducted under your guidance and leadership, and what struck me is both the relationship between childhood trauma and people's leaving the faith, but also the relationship between some people having childhood trauma and finding more succor, more sustenance in the faith, which takes me back to something that the Buddha said 2,600 years ago now. He said that basically it's with our minds that we create the world, so that the perspective that we have defines the world that we live in. And, I'm not going to get into the politics or my views of it, but I just came from a talk I gave at University of British Columbia on the current tragedy in the Middle East. And there's an example of how the perspective that you have will actually determine what you see and what you don't see, and what you permit yourself to see and what you can't allow yourself to experience. And then the perspective that you have, of course, will determine the emotions that you have in response to whatever you're witnessing. So with our minds, we create the world that we live in. The great Johnny Cash had a song called In Your Mind, and he sings, one foot on Jacob's ladder, another in the fire, it all goes down in your mind. Which means whether you're ascending to heaven or whether you're on your way to the Netherlands, the fiery Netherlands, depends on your perspective. So what the Buddha didn't say, though, which is more modern psychology, is that before with our minds we create the world creates our minds. And that happens through our childhood experience. And that's what you alluded to in your introduction. So not only are the ways we perceive the world, but the way we perceive ourselves, the way we perceive other people, and yes, even the way we perceive God or whatever or whomever that concept or that word denotes for us, can be very much determined by childhood experience. So, as you know, as we all know, and this is true in all faiths, not speaking of Catholicism here specifically, but it's true also for Catholicism or Christianity in general, is that the God you can believe in can be vengeful, harsh, punitive, and demanding without compassion, or as channeled through the teachings of Jesus, Saint Teresa, Saint Ignatius, Saint Francis, Master Eckhart, any number of saints and avatars and, what can I say, channelers of the faith. God can be compassionate, all accepting, all loving, and the source of all life. Now, this is why a word such as God, and this is a human word, can denote so many different things to so many different people. So, in your trauma survey, Significant percentage had undergone significant traumatic experiences, and some of them came to distrust the faith. Others came to have a closer connection with their faith. Then you have to ask, well, what determines the difference? And I'd have to say there's something about their experience that impelled them one way or the other way. Now, I'll come back to that, but let me first speak about child development and trauma and what that means. So, the adverse childhood experiences that you employed in your study of your fellow faithful were developed in the 1990s. And the lead physician was a man from just retired, internist from San Diego called Dr. Vincent Felitti. And Felitti was working at a obesity clinic where they found that they could help people lose weight with rigorous exercise and dietary control. But you know what they couldn't do? They couldn't help them keep the weight off. And then Felitti did something quite unusual for a medical doctor. He actually started listening to his patients. And he learned from them. They said, what do you think we're doing? We're stuffing down our pain. And that's what impelled the adverse childhood experiences studies. And they defined adverse childhood experiences as physical or sexual or emotional abuse, a parent dying, a parent being jailed, a parent being mentally ill, a parent being addicted, violence in the family, a divorce, or neglect. And for each of these ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences, the risk of addiction went up exponentially, the risk of mental illness went up, the risk of autoimmune disease went up, the risk of sexually transmitted disease goes up, everything goes up. Malignancy, which impels us to ask what's going on here. Well, what's going on here is that from a scientific point of view, as distinct from the mainstream medical point of view, unfortunately, mind and body can't be separated. And what happens to us emotionally has an impact on our physiology. Now, to those 10 adverse childhood experiences, we also need to add at least 2 more. And one of them is at least mentioned in your study, which is racism. It's a traumatic, racism is also a traumatic event. And you show that in your study. Now, what it all comes down to is that human beings aren't separable from their physical. Mind and body can't be separated. The emotions can't be separated from our physiology. And the individual cannot be separated from their social and emotional environment. And if we're going to be open-minded about it, we have to recognize that there's also to human beings this spiritual aspect. This would not be a surprise to anybody listening to me right now. But in the modern world, we split all these things apart as if they were different realms of human experience. Actually, they're not. And indigenous teachings in North America, for example, there's the concept of the medicine wheel, which has got 4 quadrants: our bodies, our minds, including our emotions, our social relationships, and our connections to spirit. And by spirit, I suppose this is another one of those words that we all use the word, but we might mean something different by it. But surely what we can all agree on, that it means a connection to something greater than we are, that we're both emanations and part of something ineffable, something great. We're not just separate little discrete little individuals running around with our individualistic agendas. An American writer, and again, the Buddha, and I'm not a Buddhist, incidentally, I just take my teachings where I find them. And the Buddha said, he talked about the interconnected nature of co-arising, that everything arises in connection to everything else. So he said, look at a leaf or a raindrop. The leaf isn't just a discrete object. It contains the heavens, the sunlight, and the water that falls from the sky. There'd be no leaf without it. The leaf contains them all. The leaf contains the earth, the minerals. The leaf contains light, photosynthesis. The leaf contains possibly the activity of humans or animals. So he said, the birth and death of any phenomena are connected to the birth and death of all other phenomena. The one contains the many, and the many contains the one. Without the one, there cannot be the many. Without the many, there cannot be the one. This would be no surprise to Saint Ignatius. I would conjecture. Well, more than conjecture. So the oneness of everything means that as human beings, we develop an interaction with the environment. And I'll read you something about brain development, and then I'll say something about trauma. So first of all, how does the human brain itself develop? Not just the human mind, but the human brain. So this is from a study, I shouldn't say a study, a review article that appeared in a journal, Pediatrics, 11 years ago now. This is the official journal of the American Pediatric Academy. And the article was from Harvard University's Center on the Developing Child. And here's what they said. The architecture of the brain is constructed through an ongoing process that begins before birth, continues into adulthood, and establishes either a sturdy or a fragile foundation for all the health, learning, and behavior that follow. Now, remember what Jesus said about rather tie a stone around your neck and throw yourself in the lake or the water before you harm one of the little ones. Because that little one is the sacred manifestation of life. And what happens to the little one will determine their lives. That's the first sentence. The second says, the interaction of genes and experiences literally shapes the circuitry of the developing brain and is critically influenced by the mutual responsiveness of adult-child relationships, particularly in the early childhood years, which means that the very circuitry of the brain physiologically is determined by our relationships with the ones who look after us. Now, if the ones who look after us hurt us or cannot protect us, that creates problems in the brain and is a setup for mental health conditions or physical health conditions. And it gives us a worldview where we live in an unsafe world. And so this is where trauma comes in. So this is important to understand. Those adverse childhood experiences are not the trauma. They are the traumatic events that cause the trauma. But trauma is a wound that you sustain internally. It's not what happens to you, it's what happens inside you as a result of what happens to you. So in my case, my trauma as a Jewish infant under Nazi-occupied Hungary for the first year of my life was not that my mother was stressed and terrified, as she well might have been. And here's a quote I'm going to give you. The child is very open and can feel the pain and suffering going on in its immediate environment.
Some wounds don't bleed. They live in silence. In the moments a child sobs in the dark and no one comes. In the way a parent looks away when their child is angry, scared, or just too much. There doesn't have to be abuse. No screaming, no violence. Just the absence of what should have been there. A warm hand, a soft voice, a face that says, "I see you." Over time, the child begins to believe, "My feelings are wrong. I'm too much. I have to earn love." So they shut down. They adapt. And somewhere along the way, they lose the thread that connects them to their true self. And when they grow up, that lost thread stretches into everything, into their relationships, their work, their faith. Because when you grow up believing you're not worthy, it's hard to believe in a God who says you are. For some, faith becomes a refuge, a place where they finally feel held. For others, it becomes a battlefield, a wound that won't stop reopening. And often, the difference isn't logic. It's whether someone, anyone, looked at them as a child and said, "You are loved, as you are, not after you fix yourself." Healing begins there, when the child we once were feels safe enough to come home.
The child is aware of its own body and can also feel the tension, rigidity, and pain in the body of the mother of anyone else he is with. If the mother is suffering, the baby suffers too. The pain never gets discharged. Trauma means a wound. That's the literal meaning. So trauma is not what happens to you. It's the wound that you sustain. But that's a good thing. Because if trauma is what happened to you, the fact that I was given up by my mother to a total stranger when I was 11 months old to save my life, if that was the trauma, nothing can be done about it. It happened. It'll never not have happened. If the trauma that happened to some of the participants in your study was that they were sexually abused, it's over. They were. It'll never not have happened. But if the trauma is that as a result they decided that they can't believe in safety, they can't believe in God, so they're cut off from spirit, or the trauma or the wound is that they believe they're unworthy, because one of the impacts of trauma is that the victim of it actually takes on a negative view of themselves. So then I have to justify my existence. Do any of God's children need to justify their existence? Isn't their existence the justification for their existence? But traumatized people tend to think they have to prove their value because they're not worthy. And children can be traumatized or wounded in two ways. One is when bad things happen to them that shouldn't have, and those are the adverse childhood experiences that your study investigated in your congregations. But children can also be wounded, not just by bad things happening to them that shouldn't have happened, they can also be wounded by the good things not happening that should have happened. Now, for example, children have a need to experience all their emotions. Our brains are wired for emotion. That's how we're born. Whether you have a creation story that you follow, or whether you believe in evolution, or whether you believe that really the creation story does not exclude evolution, but however you understand it, the way we are, the way we're created, we have brain circuits for all kinds of emotions, including joy and curiosity and playfulness and fear and grief and anger and connection and love. And all of these brain circuits we share with other mammals, and they're essential for survival. So one of the needs of the child is that they should be able to experience, express, and have accepted and validated all their emotions, including anger, including grief, But what happens in a family where children are not being hurt as such, where there's no adverse childhood experiences, but the parents simply can't connect with the child? They can't abide the child's emotions. They feel threatened by it, or they're too stressed to notice and to attune with and to validate the child's emotions. That child will shut down their emotions so that they can belong to the parents, because they get the message that if I'm truly myself with all my emotions, I'm not acceptable. And I can't afford not to be acceptable because that's necessary for my life. So that child is wounded and they get disconnected from themselves. Now, let me tell you about myself and my relationship to God. I was a militant atheist. I mean, an angry atheist most of the time growing up, because I was smart enough to know. I'm speaking of my own subjective process here. I'm not asking you for agreement. If God was all powerful, they said God was all good, all powerful, and all knowing, omniscient, omnipresent, and omnipotent, and good. Well, if God was good, he couldn't know everything, could he? And he couldn't be omnipotent. Otherwise, Auschwitz wouldn't have happened. And my grandfather, whose pen I have in my hand, he used to chew on this. He was a doctor and a writer, like his grandson, would not have perished in the fires of Auschwitz if God was all good. Or if God was good, he couldn't be all knowing. If he was all knowing and good, he couldn't be omnipotent. But why was I angry? I might have had that logical belief, and I had that belief very early, that this God picture that they're selling to me can't be correct. But why was I angry? I was angry because I really wanted to believe. I really wanted a connection with God. I really wanted a connection with Spirit, with this all encompassing goodness that created or is immanent in this universe of ours. But the picture of God they were trying to convince me of just didn't allow me to believe in that. That's why I was angry, because I so badly wanted to. So I've come to a very different terms with it now. I'm just saying that those childhood traumas can really affect our faith, whatever the faith happens to be, and our connection to that faith, and our connection to the institutions that administer that faith. So I could say so much more about trauma, but again, let me emphasize, it's not what happens to people. It's not the knock on the head. It's the concussion. It's not the car accident. It's the broken bones. It's not the sexual abuse. It's the broken soul, or the sense of a broken soul. It's not that your parents didn't see you and didn't hear you because they were too stressed and traumatized or preoccupied themselves. It's that as a result, you decided that you weren't worthy. And that can be healed. And for some people, that healing can come through their faith. Now, why would some people turn one way and some the other? That's an interesting question. And there is no right answer to it, but I'll tell you my surmise about it is that the people who did find solace and strength in their faith must have received some degree of love in their childhood that got through to their souls. So they still have some ground for faith. And the ones that turned away probably didn't. That's a surmise on my part. That would take more research to ascertain. But to make a very long story short, we develop in interaction with the environment. I'll read you one more quote here. This is from an American writer, Susan Griffith. The story of one life cannot be told separately from the story of other lives. Who are we? The question is not simple. What we call the self is part of a larger matrix of relationship and society. Had we been born to a different family in a different time, to a different world, we would not be the same. All the lives that surround us are in us. And to that, I would only add that it's not just that we're part of a larger matrix of relationship and society, but relationship with what? And with whom? Surely with one another, with the people that brought us into the world and brought us up, and either protected us and didn't, either saw us and heard us and validated us, or they didn't, but also to the universe. And that God spirit that's immanent in the universe. So what happens to us can very much shape our minds and our brains and our relationship to faith. And I can't preach to this group about how to conduct your faith or your teachings, or your Father Bill is a very adept teacher of a compassion-based, trauma-informed way of teaching the faith through his exercises and through his program. But surely, whatever we do has to be informed by our common and almost universal woundedness, with forgiveness, which is what Jesus taught above all, with, in my understanding, and with a sense of universal belonging.
In a 2023 survey of over 1,800 respondents from diverse faith traditions, 64% of those who had experienced childhood trauma reported that their perception of God shifted dramatically over time. Some described God as a cold judge, others as an unseen comfort. What shaped these images wasn't theology, it was memory. Take Maria, for example. Raised in a devout Catholic family, her father's volatility became indistinguishable from her image of God. Years later, in therapy, she realized she had internalized divine punishment as love. Or Marcus, who was abandoned at age 7 and raised by his grandmother. For him, prayer wasn't about guilt, but about survival. His sense of the divine came through whispered lullabies and meals he didn't expect to have.
Well, first of all, it's very reminiscent of my own story, because as I mentioned, at 11 months of age, I was given to a total stranger in the streets of Budapest by my mother, a Christian woman. My mother begged to take me to safety because she couldn't ensure my survival. And I've been raged about that all my life, that I was abandoned, And then at some point I actually got, that was the grace of God. The fact that the Christian woman showed up on that street at that moment when my mother was desperately seeking for some escape for her infant son, that's the grace of the universe. That's just universal love. In other words, it's not what happened that blocked your nursing students' capacity to experience God's love, but your interpretation of her experience. And when the interpretation shifted as a result of the examen or the exercises that you assigned to her, her perspective shifted. And now she could recall the grace that she'd been granted so many times. That's the first point I want to make. The second point I want to make is the grandfather's death wasn't a trauma. I would argue that grief, as I mentioned, is a natural part of our brain apparatus. But that child was probably alone with her pain. There was nobody probably to hold her and to validate her pain and her grief at the death of her grandfather. And that's what caused the trauma. Had she been able to express her grief, had she been held in that grief by somebody who, yeah, it's painful, your grandfather's gone, she would not have hated God. She would just gone through the grief where you let go and you realize that you lost something and it's gone. So it's that lack of holding, I would argue. Now, the nurse is not here, we can't ask her, but I bet your bottom dollar that if I asked her, who would you speak to about your grief and what kind of response did you get, you'll find that she was left alone with it. And that was the traumatic aspect, not the death of the grandfather as such.
Wow. Okay.
Mm, mm, mm. Absolutely. Mm, mm,
And
mm,
loss.
yeah, yeah,
'Cause
right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'd like to comment again, if I may.
Please.
Yeah, I'm not a faith-based person in sort of a formal sense at all. So I don't hold a view that there's some entity that made laws that I have to follow. But I do believe there's certain universal principles that if you transgress them, you're going to create suffering. So when it comes to sexuality, it's not a question of not for me at least, of a stern entity telling me what I'm allowed to do and what I'm not allowed to do. But there's reality that there's certain principles or laws of the universe. If I transgress, I'm going to create suffering for myself or others. Now, if you look at the teachings on sexuality, for me, it's not about rules. For me, it's about what creates suffering and what doesn't. And intimacy means the innermost. And really, you can't get more innermost than through the sexual contact in the physical sense. But it is an emotional aspect as well. And very often, sex in this society is practiced completely without regard for the emotional aspect. And kids are encouraged and culturally seduced, really, into having sexual experiences before they're mature enough to even have a sense of who they are and how to share that innermost for genuine intimacy, for genuine connection. I'll tell you a story of a friend of mine who's a doctor, and it's a lurid story, but it's very telling. Not lurid, really. It's just happened. And my friend, the doctor, worked at a sexual disease clinic, and this young teenager comes in and says, "When I have sex with my boyfriend, I don't know when he ejaculates." And my friend, the doctor, says, "Couldn't you ask him?" And this girl said, "Isn't that too personal?" So there's this physical um, penetration and intermingling of two bodies without any sense of safety or genuine intimacy, genuine connection. And that's wounding to the soul. And that's what your student experienced based on the retreat. He actually got in touch with something very precious inside himself. Now, that he can never give it back, I would give him an argument on that one. And probably maybe you would as well. If you practice certain exercises and lived a certain way, it's all there. But I understand his sense of loss. And if I can quote you, another Catholic, I don't know how you stand in relationship to Thomas Merton, but a great writer and Catholic monk, and he wrote that it is true that the materialistic society, the so-called culture that has evolved under the tender mercies of capitalism, has produced what seems to be the ultimate limit of this worldliness. And nowhere, except perhaps in the analogous society of pagan Rome, has there ever been such a flowering of cheap and petty and disgusting lusts and vanities as in the world of capitalism, where there's no evil that is not fostered and encouraged for the sake of making money. And he says, we live in a society whose policy it is to excite every nerve in the human body and keep it at the highest pitch of artificial tension, to strain every human desire to the limit, and to create as many new desires and synthetic passions as possible in order to cater to them with the products of our factories and the printing presses and movie studios and all the rest. And Thomas Merton wrote this half a century before the development of the internet and social media and all that. And I believe he was speaking to your friend's experience. And that's the culture. And so that we live in a culture where we actually have to protect ourselves from the very culture that we live in, lest we lose ourselves. That's the theme of my book, The Myth of Normal. Yes. Yeah, I'll tell you two stories. One is there's a British man called Stephen Bartlett who has a podcast, The Diary of a CEO, and he interviewed me a month and a half ago or so. No, but yeah, when I was in London, but also a year ago. So you can look up Diary of a CEO and Gabor Maté, you'll find these interviews. Stephen Bartlett was a young black man in London, or I should say in England, whose ambition was to become a millionaire by the time he was 24 years old, and he did it. And that's when he found out he wasn't happy at all. And there's another story I can tell you of a well-known NBA player who contacted me a couple of years ago. He's still playing, and at some point, his team won the NBA championship. And he contacted me because he said, I thought if only I had that championship ring, I'd be happy. But I'm not happier than I ever was. And so what I gleaned from those two stories is that sometimes it's disease or failure or some setback or crisis that wakes us up. But sometimes it's success. Because when we get it, we find that inner emptiness. And was it Blaise Pascal who said that inside every human being there's a God-shaped hole? Well, that hole will never be filled by anything from the outside. So that's the first point. The second point is that you're quite right. My trauma, which is the belief that I wasn't worthy, made me a very successful doctor. Because it means I was a workaholic, available to everybody all the time. Because every moment the beeper went, it proved that I was wanted and worthwhile, which is the hole that trauma caused inside me, that lack of self-belief and sense of lack of, like, I'm not a child of God who belongs here. And now that made me successful. So worldly success is very often trauma-driven. And when you achieve it, it turns to ashes in your mouth. Now, it's possible to be successful for a different reason, that you're called to do something and you're following your calling. When you're called, and at some point, St. Ignatius was called, wasn't he?
Mm-hmm.
Then he followed the calling. It cost him big time, but he followed the calling. Or we can be driven. Now, there's a difference. When we're driven, we're like a leaf tumbling in the wind, utterly at the mercy of forces we don't even realize are there. Well, those forces that drive us are the unconscious, created by the trauma that we experienced. And that can drive us to great success, but it doesn't lead to inner satisfaction. Or we can be called. No, our calling is different. We can answer the call or not, but we're free. We're no longer driven. And if you're called to do something, and you follow the call, you're a success already. Whether or not certain material goals are achieved or not. But it's a completely different experience. And in this society, a lot of us are driven, so driven that we don't even listen to the call. The silent little voice that the Bible talks about. And that was my experience. Well, yeah, because I realized that at least my sense of God is no longer this guy with big beard up in the sky, arbitrary, but actually it's the universal creative principle that lays down certain principles that if you look at the Ten Commandments, you could look at them as sort of rules laid down by an authority figure. But looked at another way, you could also see them as these guidelines. If you follow them, you're going to find satisfaction and a sense of belonging. And if you transgress them, you're going to create suffering. And that's immanent in the universe. It doesn't require from me a personalized figure who writes the laws on stone tablets, but it's just the how it isness of things. So, in other words, I gave up the God that I was quarreling with. Well, yeah. Mm. I'll tell you my personal take on that. I don't believe in evil as a concrete entity. I believe there are evil actions. I believe that there are people who are impelled towards evil actions, and we can name some of them in history, can't we? If you look at what happened to them, severe trauma is what happened to them. I think we created, or we come into the world, however you wish to believe, with unlimited capacity for good and also for evil. And the question is, what influences act on us? And I can tell you something. I've worked with prisoners sometimes, and this may be hard for people to believe, but some of the sweetest people in the world are on death row. Now, they committed something evil, and then something happened. In prison, maybe some chaplain visited them and talked to them with compassion. Maybe they learned to meditate in one form or another. Maybe somebody helped them understand the trauma that drove them towards that evil act. And they become totally different people. And that's not only my experience, the experience of almost anybody who works in those prisons where lifers and even death row inmates are kept, is that given compassion, people can turn. And didn't Jesus just teach us that? Didn't he say, I'm trying to remember the exact saying about how many times do you forgive a brother? 7 times? He said, no, 7 times 7, as often as necessary. And there's a famous story about the Buddha of a mass murderer coming towards him with, murderous intent. And the Buddha just looks at him compassionately, and this guy falls to the ground and becomes his most faithful disciple. In other words, there's a all-conquering love and compassion. The people that are commit evil acts and repeatedly, they never sensed that experience of that compassion. They just suffered, and it turned them into hateful people capable of the utmost evil. But I don't think it's a concrete thing. I think it's an outcome of experience. And yeah, that's what I would say about it. And I think that tension, I mean, if you ask ourselves honestly, there's no murderers in this crew, not here in my chair, nor any of the chairs that I'm witnessing. But haven't we hurt other people? Weren't our hearts closed sometimes? Didn't we sometimes commit transgressions against people close to us or strangers? So it's in us. That capacity is in us. It's like that Johnny Cash song I talked to you about. One foot on Jacob's ladder, the other in the fire. That's how human beings are. And in our schools, in our families, in our homes, in our religious institutions, the question to ask is, what conditions do we need to create that'll impel and call people towards the good in them? which is pretty inherent, rather than driving them towards the evil. And didn't Jesus talk about visiting the prisons? He says that when you visit the prisoner, you're with me. Hmm. Yeah.
But
Hmm.
uh,
Hmm. That's right.
if they stop listening deeply,
Yeah. 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 Well, first of all, I like your interpretation. I mean, I always like your interpretations. They always give me some food for thought. There's another take on sin that I can give you, which goes back to the word's original Aramaic and Greek origins. And sin means a mistake. It means missing the mark. Yeah. So when we miss the mark, we create suffering. What mark are we missing? The universal principles that either bring us a sense of belonging and connection, or the ones that rupture them. So in that sense, sin is not a moral category. It's just a mistake that we commit in our blindness. Now, the origin story can be interpreted in a whole lot of ways, um, but it does have something to do with, well, it can be interpreted in negative ways for sure, of an arbitrary God that doesn't want humans to have knowledge, because it's the tree of knowledge that they eat of, isn't it? And then, incidentally, there's an analogous story in Greek mythology of Prometheus, who brings fire to human beings, and he's chained to a rock, and an eagle eats his liver until Hercules rescues him. So again, the bringing of knowledge is associated with rebellion against godly authority. But if I look at it from the traumatic lens that you're presenting, the trauma is in the disconnection with the relationship with creation and the arrogance of us who think we know better. There's a difference between striving for knowledge and this egoic arrogance that we know better. And that's a relational disconnect from all that is. That's what I'm getting from your story. Um, a deeper analysis would take a longer conversation, which I hope to God, if I can use that phrase, we have someday soon, because it's been too long.
sure. We'll get up there.
Yeah, yeah,
Uh,
yeah, sure. Well, so the first one is, are they looking for help? Because if they're not, you can't. Okay.
Okay. Good point.
There's that expression, you can lead the horse to water and we can't make him drink. No, you can't even lead the horse to water. So don't try. You can't impose healing on somebody who's just not ready for it. What did Jesus say about casting of the seeds on fertile ground, or on, which parable I'm talking about?
Yes. Yeah.
And didn't he also say, those that have ears will hear?
Right.
The implication is those that don't have ears will not hear. So that's the first point. The second point is, people may not recall, but they do remember. There's a difference. Recall means calling back consciously. That kind of memory doesn't develop till about age 3. The part of the brain that encodes it, the hippocampus, does not develop until age 3 or past. That's why most people don't recall anything. I mean, if I ask this room, how many of you guys recall anything with certainty before age of 2.5? Very few of you put your hand up, because the part of the brain that encodes that kind of recall is not online yet. But there's another kind of memory that you referred to called implicit memory, which is the emotional imprint of early experiences without the recall for the episodes themselves. So that my mother gave me to a stranger encoded a sense of abandonment without recall. So when my wife acts in a certain way towards me, disappoints me, If I could say, oh, this reminds me when my mother gave me to a stranger, there'd be no problem. Because I'd see this reminds me, but it's not the same. That's not what happens. What happens is the hurt and the rage is what comes up, and that's the memory. That's the implicit memory. Now, use the word triggered. Interesting word. It's a metaphor. It comes from a weapon. How big a part of the weapon is the trigger? This big. How come it works? Because there's ammunition there, an explosive charge. So when you get triggered, guess who's carrying the ammunition? Who's carrying the explosive charge? So we could focus on, you triggered me and you caught. No. The real inquiry, which is the self-examination that I believe you teach, is what is the explosive charge that I am harboring? So we can focus on the trigger, or we can say, what is the ammunition and the explosive material that I still carry? And that always has to do with the past. And how you can tell the difference is that after you simmer down, most of us are sane enough to realize that our explosions were out of proportion to whatever stimulus caused them. And it was Rollo May, an American psychologist, who said that between the stimulus and the response, I'm paraphrasing him, usually this is ascribed to Viktor Frankl, who wrote Man's Search for Meaning, but Frankl didn't say it. It was Rollo May that said it. He said that between stimulus and response, there's a gap. And in that gap is our freedom to choose our response. Now, the more traumatized you are, the less gap there is. So when there's a certain stimulus, the reaction is like automatic. It's like a trigger being pulled and out goes the ammunition. Mindfulness, such as you teach and other meditative traditions teach, creates that gap where you can notice the stimulus and observe a reaction before you act on it. Now you're in a position to take responsibility. Yeah. That's what I would say on that one.
Okay.
So that self-examination, and you began by talking about the importance of self-knowledge. Well, what did it say as you entered the Delphic Oracle near Athens? It said, know thyself. And what did Socrates say? He said that the unexamined life is not worth living. And I know that the Catholic Church does not accord status to the so-called Gnostic Gospels, but historically, one could give a good argument that some of them probably are as valid as the others. It was a decision made in Nicaea, wasn't it, in the 4th century, as to which Gospels were, if I can use a Jewish phrase, kosher and which were not. But in the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus says that which you shall bring out of yourself will save you. What does that mean? It means that by examining yourself and noticing what's inside yourself and articulating it, that's where your salvation is. Now, let's grant the Buddha and Jesus, whatever you may believe about divinity or Godhead or Godhood, but let's grant them the status that they were brilliant psychologists. In other words, they understood the human soul. Why? Because they had gone through their own suffering. I mean, what are the temptations of Jesus all about? It's the same story as you see in the Buddha story, where he sits under the Bodhi tree and he's assaulted by greed and lust and aggression and hatred, and he just sits and meditates. And in the desert, Jesus is tempted 3 times, isn't he? What is he tempted towards? Worldly power, impressing people with magic tricks. And he says, no.
What if the exile from Eden, the fall, wasn't about punishment, but about disconnection? not from a garden but from ourselves. From a young age, many of us inherit stories that frame suffering as deserved, curiosity as dangerous, and knowledge as rebellion. Like Prometheus, chained for giving fire, we carry our own chains, forged in childhood. Trauma isn't always loud. Sometimes it sounds like silence, like not being held when we cried, like being told you're too much or not enough. We learn early, it's safer to split from our feelings than risk being unloved, and that's the original disconnection. The trauma of feeling separate from creation, from God, from ourselves. But here's the paradox. That fire Prometheus brought, that bite from the tree of knowledge, it's also the spark of consciousness, the beginning of remembering that healing doesn't come from avoiding pain, but by turning toward it with compassion. This is the invitation, to reclaim the parts we buried to survive, to reconnect, to know ourselves, not as broken, but as becoming whole.
We haven't lost anything. We haven't lost anything. Nobody's done anything to us. There's nothing left to forgive. So rather than teaching forgiveness, which some people do, and I'm not against it, it's just not my way. My way is to help people heal when they recognize their wholeness. And there's a very famous book called The Choice by Edith Eger, who I quote in The Myth of Normal. Edith Eger was a fellow Hungarian Jew. She was 16 years old when I was a newborn. And she lived in the same city in southern Slovakia, Košice or Kasha in Hungarian, where my grandparents lived. And she and her family were put on a transport to Auschwitz in May of 44 or June perhaps, maybe April, I think May. And her parents perished and she survived. And she's in her late 90s or mid 90s now. She's still an active psychotherapist in California. And she wrote the book called The Choice. And she actually described going to Berghof in Germany, which is Hitler's former residence. And she goes back to forgive Hitler. And she says, I'm not doing this for Hitler. I'm doing this to liberate myself. I don't want to keep him caged in my heart. I want to be free of that. Now, I think forgiveness is not something so much that we do as something that happens when we're ready. If I said to you, Bill, I forgive you, that's the most aggressive thing I could say to you. It means I haven't forgiven you at all. And by the way, isn't there the saying, to err is human, to forgive is divine? In other words, forgiveness is a divine quality, which we can channel when we're ready for it. But I don't advise people to work on it. I advise people to work on their healing, becoming whole. Then the forgiveness is something that'll naturally, I think, for a lot of people occur. And I don't coerce or induce people to forgive. That's a process that needs to ripen in our souls.
Good.
That's how I see it. Yeah.
Um,
Well, thank you for that question. This is a very tough time for me because, as you know, there's this horrendous war going on in the Middle East. And I'm a Jewish person, but I've taken a stand that's not very popular in the Jewish community, which is to recognize the experience of the other and not simply to seek revenge, but actually to recognize what drove those people to that kind of extreme brutality, not to justify the brutality. The Old Testament is it's got different strains in it if you carefully watch it. It's got a chauvinistic, tribal, genocidal strain, doesn't it? And the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu quoted the Old Testament, Samuel 15:3, the other night. And he said, remember what Amalek has done to you. He didn't quote the rest of the passage. You might know the rest of the passage. God commands the Israelites to kill every man, woman, and child in the nation of Amalek. Well, that's one strain. And all faiths And all nationalities contain that strain of paranoid chauvinism. There's another strain, though, which is the loving, humane, prophetic tradition, where we don't identify with ruler and nation and tribe, but we are adhering to higher principles, where it says, "Thou shalt not oppress a stranger, for you know the heart of a stranger, you who were strangers yourself in Egypt." That's a very different strain. Now, I would argue that both strains exist in most faiths and most nations, certainly in Christianity, in the name of which terrible, bloodthirsty events have occurred. Certainly in Islam, certainly in Judaism. I just did a 5-week or 3-week trip to the former Yugoslavia, where, as we know, 30 years ago there were terrible atrocities. What gives me hope? People like you, the good people I meet everywhere in the world, the sense that goodness persists. If I can quote Anne Frank, the 14-year-old who died in Bergen-Belsen, I think, who wrote in her diary that, after all, I believe that people are fundamentally good. It's not so much a hope, actually. It's actually a knowledge, and it's a conviction in human possibility. And those people exist everywhere, in all faiths, in all nationalities. And in my work, I got to meet a lot of them. And there's a unity of purpose, which is, how do we come together as human beings? And that possibility is what keeps me going. Let me just say also, if anybody is interested in my views in the Middle East, you can check me out on YouTube, Gabor and Israel-Palestine. Okay, and there'll be more stuff coming up, because that's an issue that burns in my soul. Without trying to convince anybody here of my views, if you don't know what they are, you can look them up. Well, my son and I are writing a book called "Hello Again: A Fresh Start for Parents and Their Adult Children."
Nice.
Based on our own sometimes bitter experience. But it's a workshop that we do together, and it's a wonderful one. And this would be a guide to come back to what you call relationship. You know, the parent and child reunion, as Paul Simon sang, the mother and child. That's what we're working on. Okay. But you'd like me to offer one?
Yes.
Let me quote to you an inmate on a death row in Texas who sent me a video. He's in the death row. He's been there for 20 years. He was 18 when he killed somebody. A traumatized black young man, joined a gang, got into drugs as he was 12 years old, and ended up killing somebody. And the state of Texas decided that not only did he commit the crime, he also has no right to belong on this earth. So he was sentenced to death. And the appeals have been going on for 20 years. He has seen his friends on death row being put on stretchers off to the electric chamber or the death chamber. And he sent me a video, and to thank me for my work, which has helped him enormously. But it was much beyond that. It's not about me. He said, because good people came into the prison and talked to me about trauma, and they told me that I wasn't evil, but I did something evil. But that's not who I am. And he says, I'm addicted to life, he says. I love life. Now, let me tell you something. If he wins his appeal, his best hope is life in prison without parole. And he wants to live and contribute to humanity. I can't offer you a prayer. I can offer you his example of what's possible, of what's actually possible for human beings. And if I can utter a prayer, may we all believe and cleave to that possibility of the goodness that's available to us.
What if healing was never about fixing what's broken, but remembering what's whole? What if, even in our darkest moments, we were never truly lost? What if trauma isn't the end of the story, but the doorway into becoming fully human? We live in a world aching for revenge, for certainty, for someone to blame. But there are still people, quietly, humbly, choosing a different path. People who sit with pain instead of running from it. People who choose to understand instead of condemn. And in the most unlikely places, death row, war zones, divided homes, healing still happens. It's not always loud. It's not always fast. But it is possible. We are all of us, capable of becoming someone new, of choosing again, of choosing connection over control, compassion over certainty, love over legacy. Maybe we're not here to forgive like gods, but to remember how to love like humans. If you're on this path, you're not alone. And that is where hope lives.